She thought she could escape the past, but when revenge takes a deadly turn, there's no going back. A betrayal, a knife, and a house that never lets go. What happens when the price of vengeance is more than you can bear? Stay tuned, because the shocking truth is just beginning. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Only the ticking of the clock filled the empty space. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway. She paused at the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. A faint smell of old wood and dust lingered in the air. She stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor. On the table, the papers sat, untouched, yet heavy with meaning. Her heart raced as she glanced at the will. The words seemed to blur in her vision, but she read them again. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the final blow. She had waited for years. The betrayal stung, as if it had just happened. He had promised her everything. But the will, his last will, left her with nothing. Everything went to someone else. Not her. Her mind spun, the room narrowing. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palm. The anger bubbled up, hot and fierce. She had loved him. She had stood by him. And now he had turned on her. The light in the room flickered, as if the house itself knew the storm brewing. Her breath was shallow, tight. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the room for something, anything. Her gaze landed on the drawer. Her pulse quickened. She knew what was inside. With shaking hands, she pulled it open. The knife glinted in the dim light. Cold steel, waiting. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding. It would be so easy. So satisfying. Just one swift motion. She hesitated. But then, something inside her snapped. His betrayal would be repaid. She closed her eyes, taking in a deep breath. When she opened them, she was no longer the woman who had stood by him. She was someone else. Someone capable of taking back control. The door creaked as she stepped forward. Her body was tense, ready. Her heart pounded louder than the clock. Each second felt like an eternity. The air was thick, suffocating. A faint noise from upstairs. But she didn't flinch. She didn't care. This was the moment. It had to be done. She was ready. She would make him regret everything. The room was silent again, but the tension was unbearable. The weight of her choice hung in the air. Her fingers tightened around the knife's handle. Each breath felt heavier, each heartbeat more deliberate. She moved through the house, her footsteps now quiet, calculated. The upstairs hall stretched out before her, empty, distant. The door to his study was ajar, the light from the lamp spilling out, casting long shadows on the floor. She stopped in front of it. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. Her body stiffened. A voice in her mind whispered, "He deserves this." But something else, something deeper, tugged at her. Doubt, fear, regret? She shook it off. She had already made her choice. Her breath was shallow, almost inaudible. With a slow, deliberate motion, she pushed the door open. His silhouette was visible behind the desk, his back turned to her. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. He didn't hear her enter, his focus absorbed in the papers before him. A wave of heat washed over her. Her hand raised, and the knife gleamed in the light. He shifted slightly, still unaware. Her breath caught, the weight of what she was about to do almost too much. Her eyes locked on him, steady, resolute. "It's too late now," she thought. In a flash, she was beside him. He turned to face her just as her arm swung. He froze. His eyes widened. Fear seeped into his features. But there was no time for words. The knife plunged forward, meeting resistance. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. She twisted it, the movement sharp, brutal. The shock in his eyes was enough to stop her for a moment. But the rage in her chest was burning too fiercely. She stepped back, her breath ragged. He slumped forward, his hand clutching at his side, blood seeping through his fingers. The room grew quiet. Too quiet. The silence swallowed them both. She stood there, frozen, watching him bleed out on the floor. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath shallow and uneven. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. The knife felt heavier in her hand, like it was no longer hers. But she had done it. She had claimed her revenge. Her mind raced as the sound of his labored breathing filled the room. She could still hear the ticking clock downstairs, steady, relentless. She wiped her hand on her clothes, the blood staining her skin.
It was done.
He would never betray her again. But as she stood over him, something shifted. She felt it. The house seemed to shift, too. The walls felt colder. The air grew heavy. And the once comforting tick of the clock now sounded ominous, like a countdown to something darker. Her eyes never left him. His breathing slowed, ragged and strained. Each exhale echoed through the room like a warning. The silence became deafening, oppressive. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out all other sound. The blood pooling around him grew larger, spreading like a dark stain on the carpet. She didn't move, didn't speak. Her hand still gripped the knife, now slick and heavy with blood. Her fingers were numb. What have I done? The thought flickered, but she quickly pushed it away.
No.
This was justice. This was retribution. But the air in the room felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating. She took a step back, her legs shaky. Her mind, once clear with purpose, was now muddled with something she couldn't identify. Guilt? Fear? Regret? Her stomach churned, the weight of the moment settling deep within her. The darkness in the room was suffocating, heavy. Her eyes darted toward the door, the hallway beyond. Leave now. A voice, faint but clear, whispered in her mind. She wanted to run, to leave, but her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from him, from the growing pool of blood. She had wanted this, hadn't she? Hadn't she been waiting for this day all these years? But now it didn't feel the way she thought it would. The life draining from him seemed unreal, like a bad dream. She wiped her forehead, but her hand came away cold and clammy. The knife in her grip was still slick, still too warm. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, then went out. The room plunged into darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat. She froze. Her eyes strained, but the blackness swallowed everything. Is he still alive?
She didn't know.
She couldn't hear anything now, not even his breath. The only sound was her own heartbeat. Thump, thump. The clock downstairs ticked. Louder.
Faster.
She could feel her chest tightening, her skin crawling. Something wasn't right. She didn't know what it was, but the air in the room had shifted. The space felt alive. The silence felt suffocating. She couldn't stay here. She turned, ready to leave. But before she could reach the door, a whisper broke through the silence. Soft, like a breath on her ear. Did you think it would be that easy? Her body stiffened. The voice was his. But he was supposed to be dead. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Nothing. Just the empty room. Her breath came faster, sharp. Her hands shook. It's just my mind, she told herself. But the air felt different now. Cold. Oppressive. A new kind of fear settled over her, darker than any she had ever known. The whisper came again, closer this time. You can't escape me. Her blood ran cold. She spun around again, her eyes wide, searching the empty room. There was no one. No movement, just shadows stretching along the walls. The air felt thick, suffocating. Her pulse raced. Her mind screamed for escape. Get out.
Get out now.
But her legs felt like lead. The whisper came once more, closer now, as if it was inside her own head. You can't escape me. The cold feeling crawled up her spine, prickling her skin. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, tight. Her hand gripped the knife tighter, the blood still fresh on its surface. She stumbled back, her eyes darting to the door. But the moment she moved, she heard it.
A creak.
The floorboards behind her groaned, as if someone was stepping on them. Her heart skipped a beat.
She whipped around.
Nothing. But the presence was there. She could feel it, like a shadow pressing in on her. Her breath was ragged, short gasps as the room seemed to shrink around her. The walls seemed to close in. The shadows grew longer, darker. "You're mine now," the voice whispered, colder, more sinister. Her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. The knife slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the carpet. The coldness in the room intensified, chilling her to the bone. The silence grew heavier, almost suffocating. Then, she felt something brush against her neck. Her breath caught in her throat. A cold, unseen hand. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her body was frozen, as if trapped in the moment, unable to escape the horror she had unleashed. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, thick and oppressive. And then, as if the room itself had come alive, the voice spoke again. "Now you'll know what it feels like. To be trapped forever." Her mind reeled, the room spinning around her. But through the chaos, one thought cut through clearly. She had made a mistake. She had wanted revenge. But she had awoken something far darker. Something she could never undo. The last thing she felt before the darkness took over was a cold breath on her ear. And then, everything went silent. The house grew still. The clock continued its relentless ticking. But inside, nothing moved. The will had been signed. And the price for revenge had been paid. The silence stretched on, oppressive and thick, settling over the house like a heavy blanket. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but inside, nothing. The clock ticked, marking time in a world that had ceased to matter. The shadows in the room shifted, swirling as if they were alive, as if they knew something that she didn't. Her body, still on the floor, remained frozen in place. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted in a silent scream that never came. The darkness seemed to whisper, moving around her, suffocating her, binding her to the floor. But she couldn't move. She couldn't escape. She had thought she was the one in control. She had thought she was the one who would take back what was hers. But now she understood. The house was the one in control. It had always been. The walls groaned softly, as if mourning her loss. The air felt thick with unseen eyes, watching her, judging her. Her mind was a blur, spinning in confusion, caught in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The whispers returned, growing louder. Revenge does not come without a price. Her heart raced in her chest, but her body remained still. Her breath came in shallow gasps, barely audible, as if even air was afraid to touch her. The temperature in the room dropped. Her skin prickled, every nerve screaming for release, for freedom. But there was no freedom. Not here.
Not now.
She had made her choice. And now, the house was her prison. The knife lay beside her, still glistening with his blood, untouched, waiting. It had been her weapon. But now, it was just a reminder of what she had lost, of what she could never undo. The seconds stretched on. Minutes, hours, or maybe it was days. She couldn't tell. The world outside didn't matter anymore. Time didn't matter. The only thing that mattered now was the house. And the house had claimed her. Her body stiffened as something cold brushed against her skin, like fingers made of ice. It wasn't him. It wasn't a ghost. It was the house. It was pulling her in, wrapping around her, consuming her. A tear slid down her cheek, cold against the stillness of her face. And just as she thought she might slip into unconsciousness, a final whisper grazed her ear. Forever. And then, the world went dark. The darkness was absolute. It wasn't the kind of darkness that you could escape with the blink of an eye. This darkness was endless, cold, and suffocating. She couldn't feel her body anymore. She couldn't hear her breath. She couldn't move. She couldn't even think. Time seemed irrelevant now. She had become part of the void. The house, the walls, the shadows, the cold, had swallowed her whole. It wasn't just the physical place she had entered. It was something deeper. Something ancient. A place where time had no hold, where regret had no end. Her mind tried to grasp onto something, anything, but the pull of the void was relentless. The whispers came again, softer this time, like a lullaby. Did you think you could change fate? Her heart ached as if something inside her had been torn away, leaving only hollow emptiness. The walls, the floor, the very air seemed to pulse with a low hum, a slow, deliberate rhythm. She was drowning in it. The darkness grew thicker. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth was sealed shut by the weight of her own actions, the weight of her decision to take a life. Her mind twisted, desperate for any escape, any answer. But the house had no answers. It only had its eternal hunger, and she was its latest victim. The darkness around her began to shift, its shape becoming more distinct. Shapes, figures, emerged from the void. They were not human, not quite. They hovered, silent, their forms undefined but suffocating in their presence. Her breath caught in her throat as one of them reached out, cold fingers brushing against her skin. It was like ice, chilling her to the bone, pulling her deeper into the dark. Fate is not something you can alter, the voice echoed again, this time, surrounding her. Revenge is a chain. And now you wear it. Her body was still, but her mind screamed. Her choices had led her here. And now there was no going back. The figures circled her, their movements fluid, almost hypnotic. They weren't just part of the dark. They were the dark. And they were not going to let her leave. She closed her eyes, but it didn't help. The coldness was inside her now, crawling through her veins. She was no longer just trapped in a house. She was trapped in the consequences of her own soul. There was no escape, only the whispering shadows, and the ticking clock that never stopped. Forever, they whispered. Forever. The word echoed in her mind, reverberating off the walls of the endless darkness. Forever. It was more than a threat now. It was a promise. Her skin crawled as the cold fingers of the shadows seemed to invade every part of her being. Her thoughts, once frantic and full of regret, now felt distant, fading, like echoes in a cavern that would never stop repeating. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her body was trapped in this endless, suffocating void. The darkness had consumed her, but it was more than that. It had claimed her soul. She had taken a life. And in doing so, she had lost hers. Time had no meaning here, but in her mind, the events replayed. Her husband's betrayal, the knife, the rage, her need for revenge. Each memory felt like a distant dream, fading faster as she was drawn deeper into the shadows. The whispers were growing louder now, all around her, their voices indistinct but insistent. "You cannot escape," they murmured. "Did you think you could control fate?" Her mind tried to hold on to fragments of clarity, but the darkness was relentless. The cold, the whispers, the overwhelming feeling of being swallowed whole. Her fingers twitched, but there was nothing to grip, nothing to hold on to. And then, in the depths of this endless void, she felt something shift. A presence. It wasn't the cold, shapeless figure circling her. This was different. A darker presence. She could feel its eyes, unseen but heavy, staring into her soul. A chill swept through her as she realized what it was. It was him, her husband. Not a ghost, not a memory, but him, his spirit. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, suffocating, unbearable. She could feel his anger, his betrayal, and beneath that something darker, something colder. You thought you could escape me, the voice whispered, low and venomous. You never truly understood the price. Her heart hammered in her chest. The realization hit her like a blow. She hadn't just killed him. She had bound herself to him, bound herself to this place, to this dark, endless cycle. The shadows moved, shifting around her, and in the depths of the darkness, she could see him now. Not in full, but just enough. His eyes glowed, empty and cold, and his smile was twisted, cruel. You're mine now, he whispered. Her breath hitched as she realized the terrible truth. The vengeance she had sought so desperately had not freed her. It had chained her.
To him.
To the house. To the darkness. And now, she would be trapped here forever, with no escape. The whispers were no longer distant. They were right beside her, a chorus of voices.
You are part of this now.
Forever. The clock continued to tick. Endlessly. But in this place, time had no meaning. Only eternity. And the darkness would never let her go. The darkness, once suffocating, began to shift. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was alive. She could feel it breathing around her, pulsating like a heartbeat, steady and relentless. Her mind spun in an endless whirl of confusion, desperation, and regret. The whispers were louder now, more distinct. They no longer came from the shadows. They came from everywhere. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, yet all saying the same thing. You cannot escape. It was true. She had tried to fight it, tried to outrun the consequences of her actions. But now, as she stood in this eternal void, it was clear. There was no way out. The house had claimed her. The darkness had claimed her. And worst of all, she had unknowingly bound herself to it. Her body felt numb, as if it no longer belonged to her, just another part of the void. She wanted to scream, to beg for release, but the air in her lungs was gone. Her voice was swallowed by the overwhelming silence. Forever. The word floated in her mind, repeating like a curse. Forever. But then, a new sound broke through, the faintest of movements. She turned her head, her eyes straining against the darkness, and for a brief moment, she saw something. A glimmer. A figure, faint and ethereal. Her heart skipped. She recognized him. It was him. Her husband. But not as she had seen him before. His form was distorted, flickering in and out, like a ghost lost between worlds. His eyes, cold and unforgiving, locked with hers. You thought you could erase me, he whispered, his voice a low, guttural sound. But it wasn't just him. It was something more. Something deeper. I'm not the one you should fear, he said, his voice growing colder, darker. Behind him, something stirred. A presence, vast and incomprehensible, loomed in the distance. Her heart pounded, her mind screaming in terror. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house, the darkness, they were alive. And they weren't finished with her yet. The shadows closed in, thick and suffocating. There would be no escape.
Not now.
Not ever. The darkness had claimed her, and it would never let her go. The air grew still. The whispers faded to nothing, as though even the darkness itself had become tired of its eternal torment. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything was silent. She stood there, frozen in place, her body no longer hers, her mind no longer hers. The figure of her husband, or what was left of him, flickered one last time. His eyes, once filled with rage, now seemed hollow, empty. She reached out, instinctively, but her hand never touched him. The figure dissolved, vanishing into the void with a soft sigh that echoed through the endless darkness. And then there was only her, and the house. The air was thick with the weight of her actions, the years of hatred and pain that had led her here.
T.
The walls of the house seemed to shift, contracting and expanding, as though the place itself was alive. She felt its pulse, its hunger, its relentless need to consume. Her mind, exhausted from the weight of her guilt and fear, began to quiet. For the first time since the moment she had crossed the threshold, she felt something akin to peace. Not a peace born from forgiveness or redemption, but a peace born from acceptance. She had done what she had set out to do. Her revenge had been completed. But in the end, it had cost her everything. The shadows no longer whispered. The cold no longer stung her skin. She had become one with the house. And, in a way, the house had become one with her. Her actions had bound her to this place, to this moment in time. And now there would be no more whispers. No more voices. No more guilt. Only eternity. She stood alone in the stillness, surrounded by the house she had once known, but it was no longer hers. She had become a part of it, and it had become a part of her. Together, they would remain. Forever. And the clock, steady and relentless, continued to tick.